So
You
let's
too.
unpack first what is seen as a pretty positive outcome, to say the least, for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. But what are you expecting next in terms of follow-through from here on out?
Well, what I liked about this deal was that it set a 6-month timeline. So it shows that both the US and Australia are serious about getting after this problem in the short term. It also reflects how there were supply chain shortages this year in the United States. For example, Ford Motor Company said that after China had put on rare earth restrictions, they had to slow their manufacturing down. So we can see that there are real short-term supply chain gaps that need to be filled. And it's pleasing to see that both the US and Australia are going to co-invest. Some of the projects will be domestic, but importantly, some of them will be joint ventures. And in particular, we see the US investing in gallium in Australia. That's because the US is 100% reliant on gallium from China.
So, of course, these investments, co-investments that you outlined as well, are going to be helpful. But to what extent is that going to actually be able to, in terms of the timeline, help the US wean off the Chinese supply chain?
Well, I was actually thinking about this in relation to the COVID vaccine. When the US sets its mind to something, it can create a vaccine in a short amount of time and really truncate that. Now, that is what our countries need to do for the processing of critical minerals and rare earths. This processing technology has been developed over literally decades by China. It has been refining its methods. Some of the methods can be environmentally damaging. We're talking about acid leaching, including straight into the ground, and there have been real problems around the Chinese mining sites. China is trying to get better with its processing, and it can be done in a more clean way. And that is what Western producers will need to do, is to do it in a much more environmentally friendly way, not always outsource it to other countries, although Malaysia, Vietnam, and India are key countries looking at doing the processing. But for a change, there's a gallium refinery in Western Australia that is going to be propped up by this deal with both US and Australian investment. And that shows that Australia is trying to move down the value chain and value add to this strategic resource.
Hayley, I know that hindsight is 2020, but I wonder why we're still talking about rare earth minerals and the dominance of China, because I remember this issue came up, 15 to 20 years ago. So how long will it take to finally the world be weaned off the dependence on Chinese minerals?
Look, it's a valid criticism to say our governments have been asleep at the wheel. However, there is just no commercial reason to do the processing. That's why countries like the United States and others have outsourced the processing to China. It's you only need tiny amounts of critical minerals that go into your mobile phone or your computer, your car, or defense applications. But if you don't have that tiny little bit, your application won't work. And so there's no commercial quantity of scale that is actually going to force the private sector to do this on their own. Anyone that knows the mining sector knows that miners like to extract as much value as possible from their mines. And there's a lot of these critical minerals and rare earths in the mine waste, the tailings, that could be extracted, but miners simply don't do it because it's not commercially viable. That's why you need the US government, Australian government, to actually work with these miners and start to value add by including some pilot processing facilities on existing mines. And that will help actually use the entire part of the supply chain.
So Albanese is now saying that the deal is about $8.5 billion pipeline. Are the public and private partnerships, from what we can see so far with still the lack of details, sort of a good setup in order to get the government incentivizing these projects?
Yes, anyone that's been following this space this year might remember that the US Department of War invested $500 million in the US's main rare earths miner, MP Materials, which has a mine in California. After the US government invested that amount of money, that's when we saw companies like Apple decide to come in, and that really crowded in that private sector investment. This deal between the US and Australia is hoped that it will do something similar. It will be a signal to industry that government is taking equity stakes. Now, this is a step change for Australia. It doesn't usually like to take equity stakes. Part of its industrial policy has included tax credits for the production of minerals, but not so much the equity stakes. Now we see Australia taking equity stakes in Arafura and in the Alcoa Sojitz deal. So this is a really strong signal from government to the private sector. And Australia has a lot of large wealth holders, superannuation companies, for instance, Australian banks, that could be investing in this now that they have confidence from government.
What are the considerations on the side of the firms from governments taking equity stakes in them?
Well, like any investor, they want to make sure that their risk is offset. And the biggest risk right now is that the processing technology does not exist. So, for instance, there's only one Australian company, Lynas Rare Earths, that has cracked the code of heavy rare earths refining, which it does in Malaysia. Now, there are fast-tracked efforts between many countries to gain this knowledge back, particularly in Japan. They're actually getting elderly people, 80 years plus, out of retirement to teach people how they did the refining back in their day. But this is knowledge and know-how that's been lost, and it needs to be gained back. But also there can be innovations so that some of this processing is done in a cleaner, greener way. And that will be really important. I think the last thing to note about that too is how those costs are passed on to the consumer, because all of that higher quality processing costs extra money. And so if those costs can be passed on to consumers, some of these companies can recoup those costs.